The day started off like any other, with the sun rising over a quiet suburban neighborhood. Officer Mark Harris was patrolling his usual route, accompanied by his K-9 partner, Rex. Rex was a well-trained German shepherd, always alert and ready to help his handler with any situation. Officer Harris had worked with Rex for years, and they had become a strong team, trusted by the department and the community alike. However, what should have been a routine day quickly turned into a tragic nightmare. It was just before noon when Officer Harris received a call about a possible trespasser near an empty house on the outskirts of town. There were no other details, just a vague report of someone acting suspiciously. It wasn't the most urgent call, but still, Officer Harris knew that he couldn't ignore it. He was just a few blocks away, so he immediately turned his patrol car toward the address. When he arrived, he didn't see anyone in the immediate area, but Rex, with his sharp senses, began barking excitedly, signaling that something was nearby. Officer Harris got out of the car and began scanning the area, calling out to see if anyone would respond. That's when he saw a figure moving slowly behind the side of the house. The person was tall, wearing a dark jacket, and walking in a way that seemed too deliberate, too calculated. Officer Harris couldn't see their face, but something didn't feel right. His training kicked in, and he reached for Rex's leash. Without waiting any longer, he gave the command for the dog to approach. Rex was well trained to respond to threats, and Officer Harris trusted him completely. Rex sprinted toward the figure, barking loudly, but the person didn't seem startled. Instead, they turned to face Rex, but by then, the dog was already on top of them. "Stop! Police!" Officer Harris yelled, rushing forward. But it was too late. Rex had already lunged at the figure, and the situation quickly spiraled out of control. The man on the ground struggled to free himself from the dog's grip, but the more he fought, the more agitated Rex became. Officer Harris shouted at Rex, commanding him to release the person, but the dog was fixated on the threat. In those chaotic moments, Officer Harris's voice was drowned out by the frantic barking and the sounds of a scuffle. The officer moved closer, but in the confusion, Rex's bite had become too severe. When Officer Harris finally managed to get Rex under control, he saw the full extent of what had happened. The man on the ground was barely conscious, blood staining his clothes. Officer Harris felt a cold, sickening realization hit him like a punch to the stomach. The person he had just attempted to detain wasn't some random trespasser. It was a high-ranking officer in the U.S. Army, Major Robert Daniels. Major Daniels was not just any soldier. He was a decorated general with years of service, someone well-known and respected. Officer Harris's heart raced as he realized that he had just made the worst mistake of his career. The person lying on the ground, unconscious and bleeding, wasn't just another suspect. This was someone's father, someone's hero. As he called for backup and medical assistance, Officer Harris felt the weight of his actions settling in. What started as a routine call had turned into a tragedy, one that would change his life forever. He could only hope that Major Daniels would survive the attack, but deep down, Officer Harris feared the worst. In the chaos, no one could have predicted the ripple effect this moment would have on everyone involved. Major Daniels was more than just a soldier. He was a father, a leader, and soon, the story of his death would send shockwaves throughout the community and the nation. After the chaotic scene, things quickly went from bad to worse. Officer Mark Harris stood frozen beside Major Robert Daniels, feeling a heavy weight in his chest. He had seen the consequences of his actions and realized just how severe they were. Within moments, the call had been made and backup arrived at the scene. Paramedics rushed to tend to Major Daniels, but it was clear that the situation was grim. The general had been badly injured, and every second counted. As emergency vehicles arrived and the area became flooded with police and medical personnel, Officer Harris could only watch. He felt a deep sense of dread take hold of him. His actions, his decision to send Rex after someone without fully understanding the situation, had led to this moment of horror. He had made a mistake, a huge one. The following hours were a blur of reports, questions, and investigations. Officer Harris was immediately removed from his patrol and asked to give a detailed account of what had happened. He sat in the interrogation room, trying to make sense of it all. He had been in similar situations before, handling high-stress moments and making quick decisions, but nothing had ever prepared him for something like this. The investigators questioned him repeatedly, going over every detail of the incident. How had he approached the scene? Why had he chosen to unleash Rex so quickly? Could there have been another way to handle the situation? The questions seemed endless, and Officer Harris found himself second-guessing every decision he had made that day. He had followed his instincts, but now those instincts seemed wrong. Meanwhile, the news of the incident spread like wildfire. Local news outlets reported the situation as a police mishap, and soon it gained national attention. The name Major Robert Daniels was everywhere. People were shocked that someone of his rank and respect had been involved in something so tragic. His face, a man who had served in the U.S. Army for decades, now appeared on every screen, but not for the reasons he deserved. The police department faced pressure from the public to take immediate action. Some people felt that the officer had acted recklessly, while others believed that the situation had spiraled out of control because of the unpredictability of the K-9 unit. Officer Harris found himself under a microscope as the public and the department demanded answers. The questions continued to multiply. Was there more to this than just a simple accident? Had there been a deeper issue with how the police handled K-9s? Had Officer Harris known who Major Daniels was before the incident, or had he simply reacted like he would in any other situation? The investigations went on, and Officer Harris could only sit and wait as the truth slowly began to emerge. In the midst of all this, Major Daniels's family was informed of the tragedy. His daughter, Captain Jasmine Daniels, a U.S. Army officer herself, was among the first to hear the news. The moment the phone call came through, she felt her world come crashing down. The father she had looked up to, the man who had served his country with honor, was now fighting for his life in a hospital bed. Captain Daniels rushed to the hospital, hoping against hope that she would find her father alive. But by the time she arrived, the doctors had already done everything they could. The injuries were too severe, and despite their best efforts, Major Daniels passed away. The news devastated her. She had lost her father, and her grief was only compounded by the mystery surrounding the events of that day. At the hospital, Captain Daniels was faced with a harsh reality. This wasn't just a tragedy, it was a public scandal. The media had already begun to dig into the details of what had happened, and the story was quickly becoming a national issue. Her father had been a respected military leader, and now his name was associated with a fatal police incident. The questions surrounding her father's death began to weigh heavily on her, and she found herself caught between her sorrow and the overwhelming need for answers. The investigation had only just begun, but already everything was spiraling out of control. The world had just lost a hero, and the consequences of that tragic day were only beginning to unfold. Captain Jasmine Daniels stood outside the hospital room, feeling numb. The world seemed to spin around her, but she couldn't grasp onto anything solid. Her father, Major Robert Daniels, was gone. The man who had taught her about honor, service, and duty, her hero, was no longer there. She had always known that being in the military meant taking risks, but she never imagined that the greatest loss she would ever face would come in such an unexpected and painful way. As the reality of the situation set in, Jasmine couldn't shake the thought of how it had all happened. The details were still unclear, but one thing was certain: her father had been the victim of an unimaginable tragedy. The news had already spread, and reporters were outside the hospital, trying to get any piece of information they could. For Jasmine, the media frenzy only added to the pain. Her grief, already overwhelming, was now tangled up with the public's curiosity and the pressure to answer questions she didn't have answers to. She tried to push the emotions aside, but they kept creeping in. How could this have happened? Her father had been a well-known and respected figure, not just in the military, but in the community. He had always done everything by the book, with the highest level of integrity. The idea that someone could have made a mistake so severe, leading to his death, felt wrong, unfair. As she thought about what to do next, Jasmine couldn't help but feel angry. Angry at the police officer, angry at the system, and angry at herself for not being there when her father needed her. After a few minutes, she gathered herself and walked into her father's room. The silence inside was deafening. She had always imagined that when she visited him, it would be under far different circumstances, perhaps a conversation about military strategy or their shared love for service. But this was not that moment. This was the moment when her father, a great man, was gone, and she was left to carry on without him. Jasmine's thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of a few of her father's colleagues from the military. They had come to offer their condolences, but there was a sense of urgency in their eyes, something that made Jasmine uncomfortable. The loss was still too raw, and they seemed more concerned with the investigation than her grief. They wanted answers. They needed to know what happened. She could see it in their eyes. They weren't just mourning the loss of a friend. They were already thinking about how this would affect their careers, their reputations, and the military as a whole. As the conversation shifted to the details of her father's death, Jasmine struggled to hold back her emotions. It was clear to her that the investigation wasn't just about finding out how her father had died. It was about uncovering the truth behind the entire incident. The question on everyone's mind was, how could such a respected and high-ranking military officer have become involved in something so tragic, and what had really happened that day? Jasmine knew that she had to find out more. She needed answers, not just for herself, but for her father's legacy. Major Daniels had served his country for decades, and now his death was being questioned in the public eye. The more Jasmine thought about it, the more she realized that this wasn't just a simple case of police overreaction. There was something deeper going on, something she couldn't yet see. In the days that followed, Jasmine began her own search for the truth. She didn't know where to start, but she couldn't let her father's name be tarnished without understanding the full story. Every conversation she had with military officials, police officers, or anyone who knew her father only deepened her suspicion. There were things being said in hushed tones, things that didn't add up. She had to find out who was responsible, and she couldn't do it alone. With a heavy heart, she reached out to a trusted friend, someone from her past who had worked closely with both the military and law enforcement. She needed someone who could help her navigate the complex web of information, someone who could offer guidance as she tried to piece together the puzzle of her father's death. Jasmine didn't know what the truth would be, but one thing was clear. She wasn't going to stop until she found it. Her father deserved that. And so did she. As the days passed, Jasmine Daniels grew more determined to uncover the truth behind her father's tragic death. She wasn't sure what she was searching for yet, but something deep inside told her that there was more to the story than what the public had been told. The incident had unfolded so quickly, and while everyone was pointing fingers at the police officer, she knew there had to be more to it. There was a reason her father, a highly respected general, had ended up in such a situation. It was then that Jasmine made a startling discovery. Her father had been involved in more than just his military duties. While his work was often focused on national security and strategic operations, Jasmine had no idea how much of his work had intersected with law enforcement. Over the years, her father had occasionally mentioned his cooperation with various agencies, but he had always kept things vague. Now, as she looked through his personal documents, a few things started to make sense. Her father had been working closely with the FBI on a few high-profile investigations. At first, she couldn't believe it. Why had he kept this from her? As a daughter who had always admired her father's strength and discipline, she had assumed that his professional life was mostly about military matters. But now, she saw that there was a whole side of him she hadn't known. She began to piece together that her father had been involved in some sensitive work with the FBI, particularly investigations that involved corruption and misconduct within law enforcement itself. It was clear now that her father was not just a soldier. He had been a key player in exposing issues within the very systems that were supposed to protect and serve the public. This revelation only deepened her confusion. Was it possible that her father's death had something to do with this covert work? Was someone trying to silence him, or had his connection to law enforcement simply made him a target? Jasmine felt like she had stepped into a world of secrets, one that she had never fully understood. She knew that the truth about her father's death wasn't going to be easy to uncover, and now she wasn't sure who she could trust. Determined to get answers, Jasmine reached out to an old contact of her father's at the FBI. She had no idea where this would lead, but she was desperate for more information. Her contact, a man named Agent Thomas Kelly, had worked with her father on several cases and was someone her father had trusted deeply. Kelly agreed to meet with Jasmine, though he warned her that the information she sought might not be easy to hear. When they met, Jasmine could see the hesitation in Kelly's eyes. He was clearly troubled by the events surrounding her father's death, and his reluctance to speak openly made Jasmine even more suspicious. Still, he offered her a few pieces of information that began to connect the dots. Her father had been involved in investigating corruption within certain law enforcement agencies, including cases involving officers who had abused their power. There were whispers of illegal activities within some police departments, and her father's work had made him both a valuable ally and a potential threat to those involved in the wrongdoing. As Kelly spoke, Jasmine's mind raced. Could the officer involved in her father's death, Officer Mark Harris, have been part of this larger web of corruption? Was it possible that her father had become collateral damage in a much bigger operation? Kelly seemed to hint at the idea, but he didn't have all the answers. He was careful with his words, urging Jasmine to tread lightly. The truth, he said, was buried deep within the system, and exposing it could be dangerous. Jasmine left the meeting feeling more conflicted than ever. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together, but she still didn't know the full picture. Her father's connection to the FBI, his involvement in sensitive investigations, and the circumstances of his death all pointed to something far more complex than a simple police mistake. There were powerful forces at play, and Jasmine realized that finding the truth about her father's death might take her to places she wasn't prepared for. But no matter how difficult it might be, Jasmine was determined to get to the bottom of it. Her father had dedicated his life to uncovering the truth, and now it was her turn to do the same. The search for justice was just beginning, and she wasn't going to stop until she had all the answers. Jasmine Daniels couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was just out of her reach. After meeting with Agent Kelly, she knew she had to keep digging, even if it meant stepping into a world she hadn't prepared for. The FBI's involvement, her father's secretive work, and the possibility that corruption had played a role in his death. All of it swirled in her mind like a storm. She couldn't let her father's legacy be tarnished by a cover-up. She had to find out what had really happened. The next few days were filled with unanswered questions. Jasmine spent hours reviewing the documents she had found in her father's belongings, searching for anything that might lead her closer to the truth. She began to realize just how much of her father's life had been tied to sensitive and confidential matters. The more she uncovered, the more she understood why her father had kept certain things from her. He had been working in a world where information was power, and sometimes, the less his family knew, the better. But now, those secrets were hers to carry. Jasmine's next step was to find out more about Officer Mark Harris, the man who had been responsible for releasing the K-9 on her father. She had done some research, and while he seemed like a dedicated officer, there were things about his past that didn't quite add up. Harris had been with the police force for several years, and by all accounts, he was well liked by his colleagues. But Jasmine couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that he was more involved in the situation than he was letting on. Determined to get more information, Jasmine reached out to a few of her father's colleagues in the military. These were people who had worked alongside him for years and who might have known something about his more recent activities. It wasn't long before one of them, a trusted friend named Colonel Marcus Webb, agreed to meet with her. He had always respected her father's commitment to justice, and he understood how important it was for Jasmine to know the truth. At their meeting, Colonel Webb was quiet at first, as if weighing whether or not to reveal what he knew. Finally, after a long pause, he leaned in and spoke in a low voice. "Your father had been investigating something big," he said. "Something that could change everything. It wasn't just corruption within law enforcement. It was much deeper than that." Jasmine's heart raced. She leaned forward, eager to hear more. Colonel Webb continued, "Your father had gotten close to uncovering a network of individuals involved in illegal activities, and he was determined to expose them. The problem was, he wasn't just dealing with small-time criminals. These were people in positions of power. They had connections everywhere, in the military, law enforcement, even at the highest levels of government. Your father's investigation was putting him at risk, but he wasn't going to stop. He was ready to bring the truth to light." The weight of his words hit Jasmine like a wave. Her father had been so much more than just a military officer. He had been a protector of the truth, willing to risk everything to do what was right. And now, it seemed that his death was somehow tied to the very work he had been trying to uncover. "Do you think his death was related to his investigation?" Jasmine asked, her voice shaking. Colonel Webb didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked away, clearly conflicted. "I don't know for sure," he said slowly, "but I think it's possible. Someone might have been trying to stop him before he could expose what they were involved in. And if that's the case, then your father wasn't just a victim of a police incident. He was a victim of a much larger conspiracy." Jasmine felt a chill run down her spine. Her father's death wasn't just a tragic accident. It was a deliberate act, and it was tied to something much bigger than she had ever imagined. She realized now that she wasn't just fighting for justice for her father. She was fighting to expose a hidden world of corruption, power, and greed. As the pieces of the puzzle began to come together, Jasmine knew that she had to take action. She couldn't just wait for someone else to solve this. The search for the truth had become personal, and she was willing to do whatever it took to honor her father's memory and uncover what had really happened. The road ahead would be difficult, but Jasmine had made up her mind. She wasn't going to stop until she had all the answers. The investigation had taken a new turn, and Jasmine was ready to follow it wherever it led. She was determined to make sure her father's sacrifice wasn't in vain, and she would stop at nothing to bring the people responsible to justice. Jasmine Daniels felt the weight of the situation growing heavier with each passing day. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but they were scattered, hard to connect, and every answer led to even more questions. She knew her father had been trying to expose something dangerous, something that could change everything. But the more she learned, the more she realized just how deep this rabbit hole went. The world of corruption, deception, and hidden agendas was far more complex than she had ever imagined. With Colonel Webb's words still echoing in her mind, Jasmine knew she needed more than just theories. She had to gather hard evidence if she was going to prove that her father's death was tied to his investigation. She had no choice but to go further, to dig into the shadows where most people would never dare to look. But the deeper she went, the more she found herself walking a dangerous line. Her first step was to track down Officer Mark Harris, the man who had been involved in the fatal encounter with her father. She had learned the basics about his background, but now she needed to speak to him directly. She hoped that by talking to him face to face, she could gauge whether he was truly a victim of the situation, or if there was something more to his actions that day. Jasmine did some more digging and discovered that Officer Harris lived in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town. It wasn't far from the scene of the incident, but it wasn't a place that would attract much attention. She figured that if she showed up unannounced, she might catch him off guard, and that could work to her advantage. When she arrived at his house, she took a deep breath and knocked on the door. Her nerves were on edge, but she had made up her mind. She needed answers, and she wasn't going to leave without them. Harris answered the door with a surprised look, his expression quickly shifting to cautious neutrality as he saw who was standing before him. "Captain Daniels," he said, his voice uncertain. "I wasn't expecting to see you." Jasmine didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I need to know what happened that day," she said, her voice steady but intense. "Why did Rex attack my father? What led up to that moment?" There was a long pause before Harris spoke again. He seemed hesitant, as though he was choosing his words carefully. "I don't know what you've been told," he said, "but it wasn't like how it's being portrayed. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Jasmine pressed further. "Then tell me what did happen. What went wrong? My father didn't just wander onto that property. What was he doing there? Was he part of something bigger? I need the truth, Officer Harris." Harris looked down for a moment, his gaze troubled. "I don't have all the answers," he said quietly, "but I know what happened. When I got the call, I didn't know who I was dealing with. The guy was just standing there, and Rex reacted. But when I realized who it was, I knew it was too late. I called for backup, but it was too late to stop it." Jasmine's heart pounded as she listened. "Who else was involved? What aren't you telling me?" Harris shifted uncomfortably, clearly torn. "I didn't want to be involved in this. It's bigger than me," he said, barely above a whisper. "Your father's death. It's tied to something I can't explain, something I didn't know about until it was too late. I thought it was just a routine call, but there were forces involved I couldn't see." Jasmine could feel her frustration building. She had hoped for a clear explanation, but instead, Harris was hinting at something more, something elusive. "I don't believe you were just caught up in this by accident. What are you hiding?" she demanded. Harris stepped back, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I never meant for things to go this way," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "But the truth is, your father was investigating something bigger than he realized. There were people in the department who knew exactly who he was, and they weren't happy about what he was digging into. They saw him as a threat, and they made sure he wouldn't get the chance to expose what he'd found. I was just part of the plan." The words hung in the air like a bombshell. Jasmine's mind raced, trying to process what she had just heard. Officer Harris was admitting to something she hadn't fully anticipated, that her father's death was not just an accident or a tragic mistake. It was part of something far more calculated. "I didn't know what to do," Harris continued, his voice barely audible. "They warned me. I didn't think they would go this far. But now, I wish I had done something differently." Jasmine stood frozen, her heart heavy with the weight of his confession. There it was, the first real piece of the puzzle, but it raised even more questions. Who were they? Who had orchestrated this? And most importantly, how far did the conspiracy go? Jasmine Daniels couldn't help but replay Officer Harris's words over and over in her head as she left his house. "They warned me." Those words echoed in her mind like a warning, and she knew she was now involved in something far beyond a simple investigation into her father's death. It was more complicated, more dangerous. The people who had orchestrated this had far-reaching power, and they had already shown they were willing to do whatever it took to silence those who got in their way. Jasmine could feel the walls closing in around her, but she wasn't about to back down. She had to find out the full truth, no matter the cost. The next few days were a whirlwind of questions, dead ends, and moments of frustration. Jasmine knew she was close, but each new lead seemed to only raise more questions. She was running out of time, and she needed someone who could help her piece everything together. That's when she thought of Agent Kelly, the FBI contact who had already given her a glimpse into the larger web her father had been caught up in. She reached out to Kelly, hoping for more answers. This time, when they met, she could see the concern in his eyes. He had warned her before, but now his expression was different. He looked more guarded, as though he knew something was coming, something that might shake everything she thought she knew. "Jasmine," Kelly said quietly as they sat down in a small, discreet cafe, "you need to be careful. There's more going on here than you realize. I've been looking into your father's investigation, and I can tell you this. He was getting too close to something they didn't want exposed. It's not just some random corruption. It's a lot bigger than that. Jasmine leaned forward, desperate for more. What exactly was he investigating? And who are they? Kelly sighed deeply, clearly struggling with what to say next. The people your father was after are powerful. They're not just law enforcement officers. They have connections in politics, business, and the military. They've built an entire system that's designed to protect their interests, and they've been doing it for years. Your father was uncovering things that could take it all down. He wasn't just looking into corruption. He was looking into a criminal network that extends into every level of society. Jasmine's stomach tightened at his words. She had suspected something bigger was at play, but hearing it laid out so clearly made the situation feel even more dangerous. The very people who had the power to protect the public were the ones involved in the very activities her father had been trying to expose. "Do you know who's at the top of this network?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Kelly hesitated before answering. "I'm not sure, but there's one name that keeps coming up. It's someone very high up in the government, someone who's managed to stay in the shadows, pulling strings behind the scenes. Your father's investigation was getting too close to uncovering this person's identity. That's why he was killed." Jasmine could feel the ground shift beneath her feet. The thought that someone in the highest echelons of power could be involved in something so sinister was almost too much to comprehend. She had always believed in justice, in doing the right thing, but now she realized that the system she had trusted could be the very thing working against her. "Do you think Harris is involved?" Jasmine asked, her mind still reeling from her conversation with Officer Harris. Kelly's face hardened at the mention of Harris's name. "I don't know, but I suspect he's more than just an unwilling participant. Harris might have been pressured, yes, but there's a chance he's part of the larger operation. He might know more than he's letting on, and the fact that he admitted to being involved makes him a key player in this." Jasmine felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She had hoped that Harris might have been just an unfortunate victim of circumstance, but now she wasn't so sure. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that he might have been drawn into something much darker than he had initially let on. The web was tangled, and the more she tried to untangle it, the more knots appeared. "What do I do now?" Jasmine asked, her voice full of frustration and determination. "How do I stop this before more people get hurt?" Kelly's face softened slightly. "You need to be careful. Whoever is behind this won't hesitate to silence anyone who gets too close. You've already put yourself in danger by digging this deep, but if you want to stop them, you have to keep going. You need to find out who's at the top of this network, and you need to do it fast." Jasmine nodded, her resolve strengthening. She had already lost so much: her father, her sense of security, her peace of mind. But she wasn't going to lose herself in fear. She had to see this through, for her father, for the truth, and for a Jasmine Daniels was more determined than ever. The search for the truth had already cost her so much, and yet it felt like she was only scratching the surface. With each new piece of the puzzle, the story grew darker, more complicated, and more dangerous. But now, Jasmine understood that there was no turning back. She had come too far to stop, and her father's death demanded justice. The weight of what she had learned weighed heavily on her, but it also fueled her resolve. After her meeting with Agent Kelly, Jasmine knew that her next step was to find the person at the top of this vast network, the one who had the power to silence anyone who threatened to expose the truth. The shadowy figure pulling the strings from behind the scenes had to be unmasked, and Jasmine was determined to do it. Her first task was to dig deeper into the connections her father had uncovered. She reviewed all the files he had left behind, looking for patterns, names, and anything that could lead her to the person at the top of the criminal operation. Each document she read, each clue she followed, brought her closer to a terrifying realization. There were people everywhere, in positions of power, who had been working together to cover up a massive web of corruption. One night, as Jasmine sat in her father's study, sorting through the papers, she found something that stood out. A name, repeated in several of her father's reports. It was a name she hadn't heard before, but it was clear that this person had significant influence. This was the lead she had been looking for. The name was tied to the highest circles of government and business. Jasmine's heart raced as she realized the implications of what she had found. But finding this name was just the beginning. Jasmine knew that she couldn't take on this powerful figure alone. She needed allies. She reached out to Agent Kelly again, sharing what she had found. He was cautious, but the urgency in her voice made him take her seriously. He agreed to help her, but he warned her to be careful. The people they were dealing with were not to be underestimated. With Kelly's guidance, Jasmine put a plan in motion. They gathered information, tracked down people who might know something, and started piecing together the connections. The more they learned, the more Jasmine realized how deep the conspiracy went. It wasn't just about her father's death anymore. It was about protecting an entire system built on lies and corruption. The deeper Jasmine went, the more danger she found herself in. She started receiving strange phone calls, and there were people watching her every move. It became clear that those behind the conspiracy knew she was getting close, and they would stop at nothing to silence her. But Jasmine refused to back down. Her father's legacy, her own search for justice, and the countless lives that were at stake were more important than any fear. The final confrontation came when Jasmine and Kelly managed to track down the person at the top of the network. It wasn't easy, and it required a lot of careful planning. But they were ready. They knew that exposing this person would shake the very foundation of the corrupt system they had been uncovering. When they finally confronted the person behind the curtain, Jasmine was ready for the truth. It wasn't easy to hear, but she listened. The person admitted to their role in the corruption, the cover-ups, and even the murder of her father. They tried to justify their actions, explaining how they had to protect their interests. But Jasmine wasn't interested in their excuses. All she cared about was bringing them to justice. With the information they had gathered, Jasmine and Kelly took their findings to the authorities. The truth was exposed, and the investigation began. It wasn't an easy fight, but it was a victory for justice. Jasmine's father's death was no longer a mystery. It had become the catalyst for bringing down a dangerous network of criminals who had manipulated the system for their own gain. In the end, Jasmine found a sense of peace, though it was bittersweet. Her father had paid the ultimate price for his dedication to the truth, but his legacy lived on. The fight for justice had been long and difficult, but it had been worth it. Jasmine had honored her father's memory, and in doing so, she had helped bring about a change that would protect others from falling victim to the same corruption. As Jasmine stood by her father's grave, she felt a sense of closure. The battle had been hard, but she had done what she set out to do. Her father would have been proud of her. She had finished what he had started, and she could finally say that justice had been served.